We are in the final week of Good to Know, where we're talking about things that are good for you to know when it comes to life, and sometimes even the things that are awkward or uncomfortable to talk about. And fortunately for you, this is our very last week in this series. So you guys ready to be done with this? How many of you are like, man, I could talk about this every week? No, says the adults in the room. So, all right, here's the deal. How many of you guys have any dogs? Anybody? Dog, you want one? I'll count it. A short story, Chelsea and I were both traumatized as children because we both wanted dogs and asked for one every year. Never got one, and so we got married and then bought a dog. So, and now he's the bane of our existence because he just yips and barks and licks and smells like a rotten fish tank. So, well, his breath, that is. We bought the dog, it's a little Maltese, and it had the underbite, and then all its little brothers and sisters, when we went to go pick him up, like, were crazy and bouncing off the walls. And he was like really cute and calm, and he was like, his face was messed up because he had the underbite, and we're like, he's cute, we'll take that one. Now he what we didn't realize is the underbite means that like he has a forest of teeth that are like not in a straight line, they're like that. And so he's gotten like 20 pulled, not really, but he's gotten like probably at least 10 pulled, and that's helping his breath little by little. So eventually, he's like 9 now, so eventually he'll probably lose all his teeth, and then his breath might smell better. So that's the deal there. But if you know anything about dogs, they need trained, right? How many of you have ever trained your dog, right? You've taught them the commands. How many of you you've been able to teach them, like, sit, lay down, roll over, shake, stay? Which one's the hardest command? Shake, roll over, and stay is what I heard. Those are the ones? Roll over. I never got Milo to learn roll over, so I'm going to say it's roll over. Yeah. So here's the deal. You guys have seen untrained dogs, right? That just like go bananas and bark and jump at anybody. Yeah, my dog does that some. But he's really well trained when it comes, like, I'll tell him to stop, and he'll stop a little bit, and then he'll like get excited again. I have to tell him to stop again. But he's really good at shake, sit, lay down, stay. Like, I can put a treat on his paw, and he'll sit there and like shake and convulse and like stare at it, and he'll like look at me and he's like, "Can I have it?" And it's like I'll stay. Sometimes I've waited like a minute and just stared at him. I've got to the point where I can walk away and be like, "Stay," and I'll like walk away and do something and come back. "Okay, good boy," and he'll like just attack it. But here's the thing. Dogs need boundaries, right? If you don't give them boundaries, what do? They poop everywhere?
They go to the bathroom everywhere.
Yes, they pee everywhere, bite people. They don't ring their bells, is that what you said?
They go muddy.
They do get muddy. They run away from you. They don't stay put. They jump on people. It's a terrible business if you don't give your dog boundaries to stay within. And here's the thing. We all know dogs that have been not trained very well. Sometimes my dog falls into that category. And sometimes we know dogs that are trained very well. But I think the idea is, especially when you're trying to teach a dog to like stay and wait before they eat their food, it's really difficult. It's really difficult to not give in to that kind of temptation when it's there. We see it play out in dogs. We see it play out in our own lives. But when it's really hard when we see something we really want to not just go and get it, right? How many of you you've got a job of some kind, or you work, you make some money, you get an allowance, and you have some freedom over some purchases that you can make? Anybody? So, how many of you've had that money burning a hole in your pocket, and you walk into a store and you're like, I'm going to save most of my money, but I might treat myself with one thing. And then you see something that's basically all your money, but you're like, you know what? Saving's overrated. I got the rest of my life to save. I want that now. Anybody? Yep. And so when we really want something, we see something we really want, it's really difficult to like withhold, to like set boundaries for ourselves. I will not spend this much money. I will not. And it's really tempting to break that vow that we've made to ourselves even. Case in point for me, this bad boy. This was my very first expensive purchase when I was in high school. A little traveler's guitar. I got to bring it on the winter retreat, which was fun. And it's one of those things that, like, I remember to this day, $300. And working at Chick-fil-A, that was like, because of the hours I worked, that was probably a weekend or a paycheck and a half for me. So it was about 3 weeks worth of work to get this. And I had the money in my account, and I would still have extra when I got it. But I remember I was starting to get better at guitar at the time, and I was starting to get involved at my church more. And so my dad was helping me look for things, and my dad actually came across this online, and I was like, well, can I get it? He's like, you have the money for it. And he's like, the rule in the house was anytime I made a big purchase, which was getting it to $100 or more, I had to clear it with them. I was not allowed to just spend my money, even though it was technically my money. And so it was a good rule, taught me discipline, but I remember this was the very first big purchase I made. But it felt so rewarding when I was able to finally get it. Now, the temptation was to go for like a more expensive Taylor guitar or something that was like in the thousands range, which would have cleared out my bank account, and then I wouldn't have had gas money, wouldn't have had that friend hang out, go to Taco Bell at midnight money, right? Wouldn't have had like the opportunity to do any of the fun, wouldn't have insurance money for my car because I had to pay for gas and insurance. And that was why I got a job, by the way, because I wanted my freedom. I wanted my driver's license. I wasn't allowed to get it until I had a job where I could pay for insurance and gas. And so that was my motivation. So the thing is, when we see something we really want, it's really hard not to go and just get it. We're going to define temptation as this: wanting to do something that may not be best for us, right? We've all experienced this. We've all experienced temptation, wanting to do something that we know is not best for us. And we can be tempted about many things in life. And what we've been talking about in this series is when we're tempted with things in it as it relates to sexuality. Because we've got technology, we live in a culture where this is just accepted. And so it's talked about, it's out there, it's in our movies, it's in our media. We've talked about this for 4 weeks now. And it's really difficult to know where the boundaries are as a Christian, because we know that sex is good, that it's powerful, and God designed it to be within marriage. But that doesn't stop us from being curious, right? I remember being your age, and the reality is we're naturally going to be curious about these kinds of things. That's not what's wrong. It's what we do with that curiosity that can tend to stretch beyond the boundaries of what is within the realm of sexual integrity, and which is this concept we've been talking about for the last several weeks. And I want you to know it's normal to be curious, to have desires, and to wrestle with temptation in this area. But what we want to do is have a good strategy. Because just like training a dog, just getting a dog and being excited about having the dog is not enough to make sure the dog is going to be a well-trained, well-behaved dog. We got to set boundaries in place so that we can get the most out of it and stay away from harm. This is the reality when it comes to this kind of stuff. For some of you, this isn't new information. You know all about this. In fact, you've wrestled with this for years at this point. For some of you, maybe you're on the opposite end. This is a newer feeling, and this is something that you've maybe not given a whole lot of thought about until this whole series. And so it's like, well, what do I do with this curiosity? For others of you, you might be thinking, this whole thing actually just grosses me out. I don't want to talk about this anymore. Let's move on to the next series, which I promise we will next week. But when it comes to sex, here's what I want you to know. Those feelings, those curiosities, those desires, that's a natural part of growing up. It's a natural part of life. And what we want to do is learn how to live within boundaries that are healthy and helpful for us and for others. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. Here's the thing. We're going to be reading more from Paul, which we're going to read a verse that we read a couple weeks ago, and then we're going to read a little bit further and expand from that. But Paul was writing to the church in Corinth, and he was teaching them, and he was encouraging them, and he was writing to them about these things. Because even back then, 2,000 years ago, this was a big deal. Okay? They experienced temptation in a little bit different ways. They had different technology, but they had just as much temptation all around them. It was much more accepted in their culture in other ways that even in our culture today we'd be like, whoa, that's crazy. People would be allowed to do that. But different culture, same struggles. And so Paul is writing to the church in Corinth. This is what we read a couple weeks ago. He said, run from sexual sin. No other sin so clearly affects the body as this one does, for sexual immorality is a sin against your own body. So what was the first word there? Run. Okay. Turn face and run the opposite direction. Now, this is counterintuitive to the way that you and I think, because I know how you think, because I know how I think, and I know how humans think. Okay? When we know that we are supposed to do something or not supposed to do something, especially you type A personalities, we want to know where the line is. We want to know so that we don't cross it, which is fair, right? But then the natural question we ask is, how close is too close? How far is too far? And it's the wrong question. Because if we're given a rule, like don't do X, then we'll do everything but X. We'll come as close to X as possible without actually doing X. And here's the thing, it's the wrong mindset. Because what Paul says is to flee, to turn and run in the opposite direction, which means don't even come near X, right? And so maybe a better question, instead of how far is too far, is what is best for myself, for others, and for my relationship with God? What is best is a much better question than how far is too far, or where's the line, or how close can I get? And so this is something that we all have to learn, but Paul is iterating this in this passage. Run, run, run. And if we can learn this concept, it will change everything in our lives, not only in this area, but in all areas. And so what I think Paul it means here is that because we are God's creation, if we want to keep and maintain sexual integrity, we will run from temptations. Other passages even talk about we will run from even the appearance of sin. And so, but we've defined sexual integrity as this. It's choosing to respond to the sexual desires we feel and think and experience in a way that honors ourselves and God. So when Paul's talking about running from sexual immorality, from sexual sin, and living with sexual integrity, it requires boundaries. It requires putting some things in place to keep us safe. And so, check this out though. It's more than just that this sin affects us more than others, because what he's not saying is that this is a greater sin. Because do you guys know what sin does? I've said this several times before, but sometimes we think about it wrong. What is sin? Just shout it out. What is sin? Okay, those are some examples of sin, but what, at the bottom level, what is sin? Doing something God tells you not to do. Yes, that's correct. But what else? Disobeying God. Yeah, that's sin. What does sin do? It makes you fall from God. Yeah, that's close. Makes you move away from God. Yeah, absolutely. Here's what I'm getting at. Sin separates us from God. So that's basically what you guys are saying, right? It separates us. I remember that because the alliteration, the S's, sin separates. It separates us from our Savior. It separates us from God. Our Savior came on our behalf because of sin, but sin separates us. And Paul tells us in Romans, when he's writing to the church in Rome, that the wages of sin is death. So sin separates, and sin is death. Sin causes death. Death to our relationships, death to our physical bodies, death in general. And so, in fact, there was no death before the fall. That's what we learn in Genesis. So sin separates us. So all sin, no matter how big or small, separates us. So all sin is equal in God's eyes. But different sins have different consequences, have weightier implications. And Paul is saying that this one is particularly different because there's no other sin that affects your body more than this. And then he goes on to say this. Check this out. He says, don't you realize that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who lives in you and was given to you by God? You do not belong to yourself, for God bought you with a high price, and that was Jesus. So you must honor God with your body. In other words, this isn't just about you. Putting these boundaries in place protects you, but it protects the temple that God's Spirit is dwelling in inside you. And when we choose sin of any kind, we are choosing to reject the Spirit living inside of us. And house against itself cannot stand. So, we want to live with sexual integrity. What I think is really cool about this passage is it also reminds us how important consent is, okay? Which is, giving our consent means that we've agreed to do something or allowed something to take place. So when we set good boundaries in place in order to run from temptation, to run from sin, and to live with sexual integrity, to protect the temple that the Holy Spirit is dwelling within inside of us, we are choosing to allow God to use us in ways that would be much more difficult if we had that separation between us because of our sin. And again, Jesus has forgiven us for our sin, but it doesn't mean that the consequences of our sin disappear. And so there's one issue where Jesus died for your sin. That was that high price. And then there's the issue of living up to that. There's the issue of allowing that to have its full effect in your life. So this is no longer a salvation issue. In other words, do I still go to heaven? Like, we're all going to struggle with sin as long as we're on this earth. But I don't want you to have to struggle with all the consequences of that more than you have to. You with me? So this is such a big deal because this is probably the biggest area in our culture today that we mess this up. Christians mess this up. Pastors mess this up. Adults mess this up. Teenagers mess this up. This is a huge part of life that we really need to get right if we want to be free from those consequences, those weightier consequences that come with this kind of sin. And so let's go back to Paul one more time, and this is what he says. The temptations in your life are no different from what others experience. In other words, when the enemy's in your head and telling you, I can't believe you're struggling with this. Like, you can't tell anybody this. Like nobody else deals with this the way that you do. That's a lie. Okay, the temptations in your life are no different from what others experience. And also, God is faithful. He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you can stand. When you are tempted, He will show you a way out so that you can endure it. In other words, we hear this line in our culture a lot. Well, this is how I am. I was born this way. You guys heard that, right? Right? I was born this way. This is just how I am. This is me. This is how I identify. For whatever sin, fill in the blank. For whatever thing, fill in the blank. This is the mantra in our culture. Be who you are. Be true to yourself. Right? But the reality is, there are people all over this planet, as long as it's been around, that have wrestled with these things and yet have chosen to rise above it and live by the Spirit instead of giving in to our desires. Does that make sense? In other words, you may think you're unique, that this is how you are, that this is how you identify, or I was born this way, that there's no way out from it. But historically, that's not been the case because there are millions of people just like you that struggle with things just like you, that have wrestled with the same issues just like you have, but have chosen to live by the Spirit and put their faith in Jesus and live according to the way that He's designed. And they've not had to deal with some of the weightier consequences that come with this, that come to choosing sin. And so when people tell you, this is how I am, I was born this way, or maybe this is how you are, maybe you were born this way and you can't control it, you have the ability to choose to live by the Spirit. You don't have to be a slave to your sin. I was born incredibly impatient. But is it okay for me to remain impatient? all the time? No. We all know this. But for whatever reason in our culture, when it comes to these issues, we just go, oh, well, this is how it is. No worth trying to change. God has called you to something better. And he wants something better for your life. And he wants to do things through you in your life if you let him. But if we choose ourselves over him, the consequences of that will we'll have to carry and follow us around for our entire lives. So when you're facing temptation, God will provide a way out. He's done it for others, and he'll do it for you too, but you can't do it alone. It happens within community. Here's what's awesome about this whole thing. We don't have to do it alone. We don't have to buy the lie that we're the only ones struggling with it, and we don't have to get our way out of it alone. We can choose to lean into the Spirit. We can choose to lean into our community. And with God's Spirit living in us, we have the power to defeat temptation. Maybe the way out for you is that sinking feeling you feel in your stomach when you know you're doing something you shouldn't do, and you got red flags going off in your head, like I need to walk away, I need to listen. That might be the conviction of the Holy Spirit trying to get your attention. So don't ignore it. The more you ignore it and numb it, the easier it will be to ignore it in the future. So don't ignore God when he's messing with your conscience and trying to get your attention. Secondly, maybe it's a text from your parent or from a small group leader or from a friend. Maybe that's your way out. It's that text of encouragement or to snap you out of whatever mindset you're in. Maybe it's a friend just checking in to see how you're doing, reminding you you're not alone here. I don't know what it is for you, but there are ways out for this. And I'm not sure what the way out for you in your individual story will be, but if we flee from sin, that's a great place to start. If we flee from temptation, and we're going to get into a little bit about what that looks like in a second. So it's the same way, like, how many of you have played soccer before or any kind of sport? Like, it doesn't work without the boundaries, right? Like, if you try to play soccer and there's no rules, no boundaries, that's just chaos. People slide tackling into each other, knocking each other over, no flags thrown, no nothing. People are going to get hurt. And who's to say that the goal is actually how you get points anyway, right? People are going to make up their own rules, and then there'll be no agreed upon thing, and then everybody will be fighting, and it's just going to be chaos, right? You need the boundaries. You need to know what's in bounds. You need to know what the rules are. And it's the same way with this. So boundaries are good, and boundaries are powerful. So let's go over a few practical things you can do right now, okay? So one is identify the temptation, right? What is the temptation for you? Is it lingering on websites you shouldn't be? Is it searching out videos on YouTube that are not going to yield very good results for you? What is the temptation for you in your life? Is it finding acceptance in the way somebody talks to you? And so you're willing to say things and do things that you're uncomfortable with in order to make that connection. Whatever it is for you, identify the temptation. You have to start with identifying it. Secondly, change your mindset. Again, if you're asking, how far can I go, or where's the line? You might be asking the wrong question. You might be thinking about it a little bit wrong. And instead thinking, what's best for me and for this other person and for my relationship with God? So identify the temptation, change your mindset, and number 3 is set those boundaries. Think about what you want for your relationship with God and what's getting in the way of that. And then set boundaries so whatever it is getting in the way can be out of the way. For some of you, if it's being places online you shouldn't go, and you're mostly tempted when you're trying to lay down and go to sleep at night, then maybe the boundary for you, and I'm just going to be real because I talk with a lot of you and I talk with a lot of your parents, and this is not something that's probably talked about a whole lot because you're the first generation to grow up at your age and have these things, right? When I was your age, we didn't have this, and if we did, it was like a little flip phone that you could just text, and that was the biggest temptation, or playing Snake for too long, right? But the reality is, we're all figuring this out a little bit with your generation, so you're like the guinea pigs, and a lot of people just are not aware of some of the temptations and concerns when it comes to this. None of you need to be having your phones in your room when you go to bed at night, right? That may sound crazy, but charge it in the kitchen, right? If a friend texts you at 3 in the morning, you're not obligated to respond. You're obligated to get your sleep to be at your best for the next day, right? You don't need the temptation to go on Instagram and look up accounts that you shouldn't be looking at, right? And you're going to be most tempted when it's silent, when you should be going to sleep. And so just get rid of the temptation. Man, that's a hard boundary you should set in your life. Don't have your phone at your nightstand. Don't have it in your room. Don't let the blue glow wake you up and disturb your sleep, right? That's just a good boundary for like habits in general, but especially when it comes to this kind of stuff and temptation, don't even go near it. Don't keep it in your room. Let me give you two situational examples. And I'm going to wrap this up quickly because I want you to have time in your groups. But if you know my wife is gone out of town, and you guys are driving by my house because you all know where I live, and you see a pretty woman get out of the car and come to my door, and I let her inside, and you know my wife's out of town, what are you thinking? Are you thinking anything good is happening? No. Okay? What if I were to tell you it's my sister? Okay, then your mind is suddenly, oh wait, that's not bad at all, right? Like, but there's an appearance. If I'm by myself and I'm posting on Instagram, going to Vegas, having some me time, going on vacation, and you see me taking selfies walking down the strip, what are you thinking? You think I'm up to any good? What's the perception there? Okay, you get what I'm saying, right? It's not a good look. You having this in your room as you go to bed at night, I'm not assuming anything good is happening there. You get what I'm saying? It's like having Vegas in your back pocket. Don't even go there. Avoid the appearance of it. Just put it in the kitchen to charge at night. Say, hey, Mom, Dad, I'm going to bed. Here's my phone. Like, can you imagine the head turns you'd get from your parents if you walk in here and go, hey, Mom, here's my phone. I'm going to go to bed. Okay, son, I'm proud of you. Okay, daughter, good job, right? Like, you would blow your parents' minds, right? That's an example. What are some boundaries that you need to set in your life, right? I don't know you, you know you. You know what the issues are in your life. So what are the boundaries you need to set? And then talk about them. Because if you just set it in your mind, it's kind of like a New Year's resolution. I'm not going to eat any more Oreos this year because I care about my figure and I want to feel good about myself. If you don't tell anybody about that, and then you go to your friend's house and they got Oreos on the counter, oh, you can talk yourself into it. I'm with a friend, right? One sleeve of Oreos later, you're going to be like, oh, I blew that one, right? Nobody would have known. If you had been like, man, I'm trying not to eat Oreos. I'm trying to watch my figure, right? They'd be like, oh, seal that bag shut. Let's have some popcorn instead, right? They'll have the skinny pop that is flavorless and void of anything fun. Let's do that, right? But if you don't tell anybody, how are you going to hold yourself accountable? You won't. You'll justify it in your mind. So tell somebody about the boundaries you want for yourself. And have the people closest to you hold you to it. Not because they're trying to constrict your freedom, but because they care about you and they want to help you. Make sense? Right, so identify the temptation, change your mindset, and set some boundaries that are practical and helpful for you. So as you get ready to go to your groups, what's one boundary that you could set for yourself? Right, I've given you a few examples. What's a boundary you could set for yourself? Think about that. I'm going to pray. You'll go to your groups and we'll be done.